imagine picking up a book, opening it right to the preface, and the very first thing the author tells you is to put it down.
Yeah, it's quite the opening.
Right. Imagine a text so openly controversial, so convinced of its own disruptive architecture, that it explicitly warns you. It says, if you're looking for gentle reassurance, walk away.
If you want saccharine platitudes, return the book.
Exactly. Go watch daytime television, do anything else, because what follows is designed to dismantle your worldview with the precision of a sledgehammer going through a greenhouse.
It's a striking rhetorical move. He's establishing a boundary right away, basically daring the reader to proceed while warning them that the intellectual terrain ahead is deeply hostile to comforting illusions.
It really is. So welcome to today's deep dive. I'm so glad you're joining us. And before we go any further, I need to remind you right at the top, please make sure to like and subscribe to the show. Because today we are reviewing a really provocative, highly intense new ebook that you can actually go buy right now on Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books. We're looking at a text called Childish Thinking, Sawing Off the Limbs of the World Tree by Conrad Riker. And wow, let me tell you, this is a heavy, complex read.
It is remarkably dense. The text operates on multiple simultaneous levels: historical, philosophical, legal, and economic.
It takes a lot of active parsing to map out how he connects all these different fields.
It really does.
We need to set the stage here, though, because the target audience for this book is very specific. Riker has written this directly for men's rights activists and what is colloquially known as the red-pilled manosphere.
That's the explicit audience, yeah.
He presents this book as a declaration of intellectual war against what he describes as the modern feminist and Marxist institutional capture of Western civilization. He's writing to an audience of men who feel they've watched their foundational institutions, the courts, the universities, governments be turned into weapons against them.
And he's attempting to map the history of those institutions before that alleged capture took place.
Which brings us to a crucial point about our mission today. If we're going to unpack a text like this, we have to make it abundantly clear to you, the listener, that this book contains highly politically charged content.
Very charged.
We are not taking sides here.
Nope.
We are not endorsing the viewpoints of the author, nor are we condemning them. Our goal on this deep dive is purely analytical. We're going to impartially report on the contents, map out the author's highly specific arguments, and help you understand the systematized worldview presented in this text.
We are exploring the architecture of his argument piece by piece. Because whether you agree with the author's premises or vehemently oppose the conclusions he draws, this book is built on something that makes it fascinating to dissect.
Right, the formal proofs.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Riker relies heavily on rigorous formal proofs, syllogisms, Aristotelian logic, and empirical data to attempt to completely deconstruct modern society.
It's basically an exercise in structural logic. So let's just jump in. What is the core premise we're dealing with here?
The central thesis of the book is that Western civilization was fundamentally built on masculine reason, which he aligns with the Greek concept of logos, objective truth, logic, hierarchical structure, verifiable reality.
Okay.
But the text argues that our modern institutions have been systematically captured by feminine emotion, or eros, meaning that, according to the author, elevating subjective feelings and emotional validation above objective truth has led society into a state of mass solipsism. And this epistemological shift is the direct cause of what he sees as an impending civilizational collapse.
Mass solipsism. Let's examine how the text constructs that argument, looking specifically at what Riker calls the epistemological war logic versus lived experience. You hear the phrase lived experience constantly now, right? In corporate environments, universities, social media. And the author is directly targeting the philosophical foundation of that concept.
The text mounts a severe critique of what academia terms standpoint epistemology. This is the sociological theory proposing that a person's perspective, their lived experience, particularly if they belong to a historically marginalized group, grants them unique and unassailable access to truth.
And the author completely rejects this framework.
Entirely. He argues that treating feelings as facts is the very definition of solipsism. Philosophically, solipsism is the idea that only one's own mind is certain to exist.
The analogy he uses in the text is aggressive. He states that relying on lived experience isn't a form of rigorous inquiry. It's surrendering to the cognitive whimsy of a child who thinks the world literally disappears when they close their eyes. I feel, therefore I know.
He compares it to eating candy for dinner simply because vegetables taste bitter. It's framed as a complete rejection of the objective in favor of emotional volatility.
To ground this claim, the text traces this vulnerability all the way back to the foundational myths of Western culture. He offers a really unique interpretation of Genesis 3, the fall in the Garden of Eden.
Right, the argument is that this story is not a historical account of horticulture.
Definitely not.
It's a structural warning about human firmware. In this reading, Adam represents the masculine principle of objective truth, protection, and provision. Eve represents the feminine principle of beauty, nurture, and reception.
And the catastrophe, the fall, happens because the feminine principle accepts an external emotional pitch over an objective command.
Yes, and crucially, the masculine principle capitulates to that emotional subversion rather than defending the objective boundary.
The text highlights the rhetorical strategy of the serpent here, which is fascinating. The serpent doesn't approach with a logical syllogism or empirical data.
No, it uses history's first unfalsifiable assertion.
You will not surely die. The author calls this an emotional spell, and he draws a direct line between that serpent's whisper and modern political slogans like, gender is a social construct.
The argument is that these are not factual claims meant to be tested. They are emotional hostage-taking mechanisms designed to subvert an existing logical order.
The serpent's question, did God really say, is framed in the book as the precursor to modern deconstructionist questions like, who defines what a woman is?
The author posits that it's not a genuine search for definitions, but an attempt to destroy definition itself. Chaos is described as the medium in which the weak subvert the strong.
And to support this biological and psychological claim, the text pulls heavily from Arthur Schopenhauer, specifically the 1851 essay on women.
He leans into Schopenhauer's observation that women possess what biologists call neoteny.
For the listener who might not be familiar with that term, how does the text utilize neoteny to build its case?
Neoteny is a biological term referring to the retention of juvenile or childlike physical and behavioral traits into adulthood. The author uses Schopenhauer to argue that this neoteny makes women excellent, empathetic nurturers, which is absolutely vital for infant survival and child rearing.
But the text claims this exact same biological trait makes them catastrophic civilization builders.
Because building a civilization requires the exact opposite of immediate emotional response.
Right, you can't build a suspension bridge, or engineer a power grid, or enforce a rigid legal contract based on how you feel in a given moment. Long-term thinking requires suppressing the immediate emotional impulse in favor of an abstract principle.
The author argues that by empowering emotional reasoning at the highest levels of governance and institutional power, society has essentially handed the controls of a complex machine to an overgrown child.
And is now shocked that the machine is failing.
Exactly. The text then tests this theoretical framework against reality by examining how institutions behave when they adopt this feeling-first epistemology.
Let's look at how he tries to prove this institutional capture. He relies heavily on the 2006 Duke University lacrosse case. The book details how an exotic dancer named Crystal Mangum falsely claimed she was gang-raped by white lacrosse players.
The text points out that despite the physical evidence contradicting the timeline, and despite the DNA evidence entirely exonerating the players, the institutions, specifically the media and the university faculty, clung to the false narrative.
The author specifically notes that 88 Duke faculty members signed a public letter essentially convicting the students in the court of public opinion before any trial had taken place.
And long after the evidentiary timeline had collapsed.
So the text asks, why?
The author's answer is that it occurred because the narrative fit their theology. The objective facts didn't matter because the lived experience of the accuser and the ideological framework of the academics demanded that the story be true.
The book states that this is the hallmark of an institution captured by solipsism. When reality contradicts the narrative, the institution discards reality.
Now, how does the author bridge this critique of modern media narratives to a critique of sociological theories like patriarchy?
This is where it gets really intense. He attempts to completely dismantle the concept using a historical event, the sinking of the Titanic in 1912. The statistics cited in the book are stark. 75% of the women on board survived.
And only 20% of the men survived.
In freezing water, facing certain death, men died at nearly 4 times the rate of women. So how does he use a shipwreck from 1912 to attempt to debunk a modern sociological theory like patriarchy? Those seem totally disconnected.
It seems that way until you look at how the text defines exploitation through a formal syllogism. The author states a major premise. Systems of exploitation are fundamentally defined by the transfer of resources from the exploited class to the exploiting class.
Feudalism transfers agricultural resources from peasants to lords. Slavery transfers labor from slaves to owners. So exploitation has a definitive mathematical direction.
Precisely. Then the text introduces the minor premise. The modern feminist theory of patriarchy claims that society is a system designed by men, for the benefit of men, to exploit women.
But the conclusion the author draws from empirical data like the Titanic survival rates or workplace fatality statistics where men account for over 90% of deaths is that the resources flow in the opposite direction.
Including the ultimate resource of human life. Men historically sacrifice themselves, freezing in the Atlantic, so women and children can take the limited space in the lifeboats.
Therefore, the author concludes, patriarchy theory fails basic Aristotelian logic. The host does not sacrifice itself for the parasite.
The book poses a relentless rhetorical question here. What did men get for looking at the black water and choosing death so others might live?
A century of feminist academic theory explaining how oppressed women were by the very men who froze to death on their behalf. The author is asking you to reconsider the very nature of oppression, privilege, and sacrifice.
The text is forcing the reader to confront a structural cognitive dissonance. If the system is designed to benefit men at the expense of women, why are men the demographic disproportionately dying in the coal mines, on the oil rigs, and in the freezing oceans?
The author's answer is that civilization itself is fundamentally a wealth, labor, and security transfer mechanism from men to women, and that feminism is an ideology that obscures this reality while demanding even more extraction.
If this rejection of objective reality is the philosophical root, how does the text claim it actually manifests in our daily lives? Let's look at the financial architecture targeted in the book.
This brings us to Section 2, the economics of the argument. Taxes, the state, and the parasite-host dynamic.
The book relies heavily on a 2020 research study conducted by Christian Niemitz for the Institute of Economic Affairs in the UK. The data points to a massive fiscal asymmetry between the sexes.
The financial syllogism. The numbers laid out in the text are highly specific. According to this research, men in the UK are net positive taxpayers over their lifetimes, specifically to the tune of roughly £150,000.
They pay more into the system than they take out in state services.
And women, conversely, are net recipients over their lifetimes. They consume more in state services, healthcare, and welfare than they contribute in taxes.
The author uses this data to advance his boldest political claim yet, that female suffrage, the act of giving women the right to vote, inevitably and mathematically leads to a massive expansion of the welfare state.
The argument is that universal franchise assumes all votes are equal, but all voters are not equal in their material relationship to the state apparatus.
If one demographic is a net funder of the Treasury and another is a net consumer of the Treasury, expanding the vote to the consumers will naturally result in policies that expand consumption and taxation.
The text backs this up with modern voting data from the 2020 U.S. elections. Unmarried women voted 68% for the candidate proposing massive state expansion. Married women voted roughly 50%.
The gap is glaring.
It is. The author's thesis is that the modern administrative state essentially extracts wealth from men at gunpoint, arguing that all taxes are ultimately backed by the threat of imprisonment or state violence to act as a surrogate husband and provider for unmarried women.
The book describes this as a shift from private patriarchy to public patriarchy. In this view, women didn't become independent. They simply transferred their financial dependency from individual husbands to the male taxpayer collective via the state.
And the author places this in a vast historical context. He points to ancient Sparta. Sparta gave women unprecedented property rights and political influence compared to other Greek city-states,
only to face demographic and military collapse shortly after, as land concentrated in the hands of heiresses, while the male citizen soldier population plummeted.
The text goes through Rome as well. It analyzes the bread and circuses the free grain dole for the Roman mob, which the author equates to ancient welfare, and the Byzantine Empire.
In all these cases, the book claims that as female political influence grew, and as citizenship was detached from physical duty, the civilization declined.
He makes the point that universal male suffrage was not a patriarchal privilege giving at birth. It was bought with blood. Men earned the vote by signing up for the military draft, by dying in the mud at the Somme or in the American Civil War.
The argument is that when women demanded the vote, they demanded the rights of citizenship without the physical obligations, such as registering for selective service.
Which brings us to what the author terms the autopsy of the Swedish experiment. Sweden is frequently held up globally as the pinnacle of progressive feminist governance.
And the text spends considerable time deconstructing this reputation. In 2014, Sweden declared itself the world's first feminist government. They officially implemented a feminist foreign policy.
Yes, and the text points out that by 2022, they officially abandoned the policy amid a massive, unprecedented surge in violent crime.
The author highlights the Nordic gender equality paradox. This paradox reveals that in the most egalitarian, gender-neutral societies on Earth, men and women actually diverge more in their career choices, not less.
Swedish women, despite every incentive and quota, continue to cluster in public sector and caring professions, while men still dominate STEM fields and dangerous physical infrastructure jobs.
But the darker side of this Swedish autopsy is the societal decay the author outlines. The text points out that before the feminist government, Sweden was statistically one of the safest societies on Earth.
8 years later, it boasted Europe's highest rates of gang violence, bombings, and grenade attacks.
The author explicitly correlates this breakdown to feminist governance. He argues that feminism is a parasitic ideology that relies entirely on the safe, prosperous institutions built by masculine order.
When feminist ideology takes over and prioritizes empathy, open borders, and offender rehabilitation over strict masculine order, deterrence, and border enforcement, the society becomes incredibly vulnerable to non-feminist, highly aggressive external cultures.
The rights disappear because the men who historically enforced the peace have been sidelined and demonized. It's a sobering application of public choice theory.
He's arguing that an electorate driven by female emotional preferences, compassion, inclusion, safety nets, will inevitably vote for policies that sound kind in the short term, but are structurally suicidal in the long run because they ignore the harsh realities of resource scarcity and human aggression.
Let's transition into how the text claims the structural shift impacts individuals on a daily basis. The book gets incredibly granular about institutional capture,
focusing on the courts, the campus, and the clinic. Let's start with the legal system. It takes a blowtorch to the family court system, which the author refers to as a gulag.
The author traces the legal origin of this system to the 1839 Custody of Infants Act in the United Kingdom, which was heavily driven by the campaigning of Caroline Norton.
Prior to this, under common law, custodial rights were inextricably linked to custodial responsibilities.
Fathers had custody because they had the absolute binding legal obligation to financially provide for the household. You could not separate the legal authority from the financial responsibility.
But the modern system completely severs that link. The text attacks the phrase heard in nearly every modern divorce proceeding in the best interests of the child.
The author calls this phrase an operational fraud. The book argues that it has no falsifiable criteria. It's a meaningless, subjective phrase used by judges as a blank check to strip fathers of their due process, their property, and their children, based entirely on the emotional whims of the court.
The statistics cited in this section are utilized to paint a picture of systemic bias. The text notes that women initiate 70 to 80% of all divorces, and they are awarded primary custody in approximately 82% of cases.
Yet the father is still assigned the financial responsibility under threat of wage garnishment and imprisonment.
The author constructs another syllogism here. Legal systems that arbitrarily strip one class of persons of property and parental rights without due process are tyrannical. Family courts do precisely this to fathers, therefore family courts are tyrannical institutions.
The book refers to the entire apparatus as a sophisticated extortion racket wearing judicial robes.
It's framed as a total inversion of justice. The argument is that fathers retain all the historical obligations while mothers receive all the modern authority, and society pretends this is progress.
This institutional decay, according to the text, is perfected in the ivory tower. The book turns its attention to universities next,
describing them not as sanctuaries of learning or objective inquiry, but as grievance factories. Let's examine how the text tries to prove this lack of academic integrity.
The author relies heavily on the affiliate hoax. The book uses a real-world event to argue that peer review in the humanities is completely dead.
We're talking about the grievance studies affair orchestrated by James Lindsay, Peter Boghossian, and Helen Pluckrose.
To test the rigor of fields like gender studies and critical race theory, these three academics submitted intentionally absurd hoax papers to peer-reviewed journals.
The most famous of these, which the author highlights as the ultimate proof of institutional capture, was a paper where they literally took a chapter of Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf.
They rewrote it by simply replacing the word Jews with men and Germany with womanhood.
And it was published. A feminist social work journal called Ophelia published a paper titled Our Struggle is My Struggle: Intersectional Feminism as a Framework for Critical Praxis. It passed blind peer review.
Nazi propaganda, dressed up in modern feminist academic jargon, was accepted as legitimate scholarship.
The author uses this as a devastating proof of concept. These fields do not track truth, they track ideological compliance. The argument is that if you use the right buzzwords to attack men, you can publish anything, regardless of its underlying horror.
The text extends this critique to how universities handle internal discipline, specifically Title IX campus tribunals.
The book points out that universities, heavily incentivized by the threat of losing federal funding, utilize a single investigator model for accusations of sexual assault. This means one university administrator acts as the detective, the prosecutor, the judge, and the jury.
The author compares it to the Spanish Inquisition. He states that the Inquisition actually provided more procedural rights to the accused than a modern male college student gets today under Title IX.
They operate on a preponderance of evidence standard, meaning only 51% certainty is required, and routinely deny young men the right to cross-examine their accusers or have legal representation present in the room.
The text claims that convictions are practically predetermined because the institution needs male sacrifices to appease federal overseers and maintain their funding stream. It's a chilling look at the legal mechanics of academia.
And this transitions seamlessly into the book's critique of the medical-industrial complex. The author asserts that modern medicine and psychology have essentially pathologized normal male biology and boyhood behavior.
The text starts with the clinical approach to domestic violence, specifically the Duluth model. This model was created in 1981 in Duluth, Minnesota, by two feminist activists, Ellen Pence and Michael Paymar.
The book points out that neither of them had scientific or clinical credentials, yet they created a model centered around the power and control wheel that assumes, by default, that domestic violence is always a male perpetrator exerting patriarchal control over a female victim.
The author notes that this baseline assumption was baked into police training, arrest mandates, and clinical psychology worldwide.
The text argues this happened despite massive empirical evidence from sociologists showing that reciprocal violence, where both partners are violently engaged, is actually the most common dynamic, and that women initiate unilateral violence at comparable or higher rates than men.
The book claims the ideology required male culpability, so the objective clinical science was simply ignored.
The argument then shifts to the treatment of male children. The book details the staggering rates at which young boys are diagnosed with learning disabilities or ADHD simply because they exhibit normal masculine energy.
They're competitive, they're physical, they lack impulse control in confined spaces.
The text argues that the modern educational system prioritizes docility, compliance, and sitting still, which inherently favors female development.
When boys naturally fail to conform to this female behavioral standard, they are literally drugged into placid compliance with amphetamines. The author calls it chemical warfare against male vitality.
This leads to what is arguably the darkest and most controversial analytical framework in the entire book, the author's formal equivalence table. This is where the text compares modern feminist rhetoric to historical genocidal hate speech.
The text takes phrases like toxic masculinity or hashtags like kill all men that are routinely tolerated by social media platforms and university administrations and subjects them to formal linguistic analysis.
How does the author justify equating modern social justice terminology with genocidal rhetoric?
His argument is that the mechanics of dehumanization are structurally identical, even if the target has changed. The text argues that before a society can eradicate a group or systematically strip them of their rights and property, the public must be convinced that the group is definitionally harmful simply by existing.
You have to conceptualize the demographic as a pathogen.
Yes, if the concept of man becomes inextricably linked with terms like toxic or oppressor, then harming a man is no longer viewed as an injustice. It is viewed as social hygiene, becomes justice for historical crimes.
The book states that if men are defined as oppressors by ontological status just by being born male, then any disadvantage a man suffers is viewed as cosmic karma. If he loses his children in family court or his career to a false accusation, it's not a tragedy, it's payback for thousands of years of patriarchy.
It's described as a closed loop of eulogic designed to pathologize the male sex itself. The author calls this the grammar of genocidal resentment.
The text strongly advocates for a return to the trivium grammar, logic, and rhetoric. The author believes that by mastering these classical tools of thought, you can break these emotional spells.
The trivium is viewed as an intellectual defense mechanism against ideological manipulation.
So, if this is the state of the institutions, what does this all mean for the people actually living within this system? The text pivots here to Section 4 to examine the psychological and social outcomes.
Specifically, the decline of happiness and the strategic response of men. Because the ultimate irony presented in the book is that despite achieving total institutional capture, women are not actually happier.
This is a crucial piece of empirical data for the author's overall thesis. The text heavily cites the Stevenson-Wolfer study out of the University of Pennsylvania.
This massive study examined 35 years of general social survey data and discovered a glaring paradox.
Since the 1970s, as the feminist movement achieved every one of its stated structural goals, workplace access, reproductive rights, no-fault divorce, educational parity, female happiness has declined, both in absolute terms and relative to male happiness.
The Stevenson-Wolfer's paradox. They got everything they demanded, and the data shows they are more miserable.
The author's analysis of this data is scathing. The book argues that because feminist ideology functions like a fundamentalist religion that cannot admit structural error, it continuously doubles down.
When the medicine makes the patient sick, the ideological doctors prescribe more of the exact same poison. More atomization, more career pressure, more antidepressants.
The text points out the paradox that the modern Western woman is legally the most liberated female in human history and simultaneously the most heavily medicated.
The author traces a large part of this misery to macroeconomic shifts, specifically pointing to 1971, when Richard Nixon unilaterally removed the US dollar from the gold standard.
The text argues this wasn't merely a shift in monetary policy, it was the weaponization of fiat currency against the nuclear family.
By decoupling money from a hard asset, the government was free to infinitely inflate the currency. The book argues this destroyed the purchasing power of this single-income family wage.
The author posits this essentially forced women into the labor market just to maintain a basic middle-class standard of living. It flooded the labor pool with millions of new workers, massively suppressing wages for everyone.
The text states that feminism celebrates this as liberation, but it's really just corporate wage suppression masquerading as liberation theology.
Women traded the nursery for the cubicle, they replaced the cradle with the spreadsheet, and the state stepped in to raise the children in industrialized daycare centers.
The text asserts that a culture that considers human resources management or quarterly corporate earnings more valuable than human formation, the actual raising of children deserves the generation of attachment-disordered adults it produces.
The cradle falls because the mother left it empty to attend a corporate Zoom meeting. It's a profound critique of the intersection between corporate fiat capitalism and feminist ideology.
Given all of this, how does the text describe the male reaction? The book introduces the MGTOW movement, men going their own way.
Mainstream media usually frames this as a fringe group of bitter, angry men who can't get dates. How does the author redefine this movement?
He frames MGTOW completely differently. He frames it as a rational economic calculation and a deeply stoic response to a hostile environment.
If a system is mathematically rigged, if marriage means a 70% chance of divorce initiated by the wife, followed by the high probability of losing assets and children in a biased family court system, then participating in that system offers a negative expected value for men.
It's basic game theory. If the game is rigged, the only winning move is not to play.
Right.
The text argues that feminist ideology cannot conceive of male existence outside of the context of female approval or utility, so it labels male withdrawal as a childish tantrum.
But MGTOW, in the author's view, is strategic, rational disengagement. A man can't change the laws, the culture, or the family courts. He can only control his own participation.
By withdrawing their labor, their utility, their taxes, and their physical protection from a society that openly despises them, these men are preserving their resources and their sanity.
The framework built thus far relies on diagnosing the disease, but the final massive segment of this book offers a specific radical cure. This is the architecture of exit building the New Jerusalem.
His solution is explicitly not reform. He tells his readers in no uncertain terms, do not try to reform the current system. You cannot vote your way out of this.
You cannot compromise with an ideology that views your very biological existence as a structural problem. As the text puts it, the parasite has no incentive to leave the host.
Therefore, the only viable strategy is the construction of completely parallel institutions.
The architecture of exit. This sounds conceptually similar to what conservative writer Rod Dreher called the Benedict option, withdrawing from a corrupt mainstream culture to build resilient local communities.
It is, but Riker applies it specifically to masculine logocentric principles.
What does this architecture actually look like in practice, according to the book?
It looks like Bitcoin and decentralized cryptocurrency to escape a feminist-captured inflationary fiat financial system.
It looks like gig work, independent contracting, and remote employment to entirely bypass corporate HR departments and diversity quotas.
It looks like independent, decentralized media networks and physical servers that cannot be censored or shadow banned by Silicon Valley.
It looks like homeschooling cooperatives and classical academies that rigidly teach grammar, logic, and rhetoric instead of gender theory and critical race studies.
The author is urging men to build an immune system that kills the parasite by starving it of the host's energy. Stop funding the institutions that hate you.
The text is calling for an invisible brotherhood of men who recognize objective reality and commit their labor strictly to constructing alternatives that honor that reality.
To drive this point home, the book ends with an absolutely massive, powerful metaphor comparing logocentric hierarchy to gynocentric equality.
The text takes the reader back to the year 1220 AD, to the construction of Chartres Cathedral in France.
The author uses this as a masterclass in rhetorical contrast. The text describes a master mason at a limestone quarry, meticulously selecting a stone that will not even be placed into the vaulted ceiling of the cathedral until his own grandson is an old man.
It's a vision of extreme masculine competence, generational long-term thinking, and a strict, unforgiving hierarchy where a single misplaced keystone would bring the entire massive structure crashing down.
It took 200 years of continuous, highly disciplined male labor and structural engineering to build Chartres Cathedral.
200 years of intergenerational focus. And the author contrasts that medieval masterpiece with a modern example of equality and leaderless autonomy, the 2020 CHOP zone in Seattle, the Capitol Hill occupied protest.
The text details how this zone declared itself an autonomous, leaderless utopia entirely free from oppressive hierarchies, police, and traditional structures.
And the book details exactly what happened next. The text points out that within 72 hours of declaring this leaderless utopia, an armed warlord named Raz Simone had violently taken over, patrolling the perimeter with armed guards and beating dissenters.
The author's takeaway is that hierarchy is biologically and socially inevitable. Nature abhors a vacuum.
The moment you dissolve a competence-based hierarchy like the Masons at Chartres, a power-based hierarchy based on raw violence immediately fills the void.
One hierarchy built the Sistine Chapel and split the atom. The other hierarchy built the CHOP zone's cardboard outhouses and immediately devolved into tyranny.
It is a devastating juxtaposition to end the book on. The author states you are not witnessing the collapse of competence, you are witnessing the enforced triumph of incompetence.
The text argues that every diversity hire is a load-bearing brick removed from the cathedral and replaced with colored papier-mâché.
The evidence, according to the author, is not ambiguous. He challenges the reader directly: will you rebuild on logocentric foundations or perish in the ruins of your own solipsistic chaos? The choice is entirely up to you.
It's a sweeping, systematized, and unapologetically brutal assessment of modernity.
We've covered incredible ground today. We've mapped out the epistemological war between logic and lived experience, the economic parasite-host dynamic, the capture of our courts and campuses, and the proposed architecture of exit.
It's a lot to take in.
It is. But before we wrap up, let's look at the broader implications. Let's leave you with a final provocative thought, something that builds on Riker's text but pushes it even further into the realm of speculation.
If we accept the author's ultimate solution, total exit, and the building of a new Jerusalem of parallel institutions, we're forced to ask a profound question about the future of the species.
If a society completely bifurcates, with one half of the population living in legacy, state-funded, feeling-based institutions, and the other half, specifically the most productive, logically oriented men, retreating into parallel, logic-based, male-centric enclaves, what happens to the human family?
The author advocates for men to protect themselves. But can a civilization truly survive, biologically or spiritually, if men and women are living in entirely separate, hostile institutional realities?
If the sexes can no longer share a common epistemology, do we simply split into two different species of society? It's a fascinating, complex prospect to ponder, two entirely separate institutional realities.
A massive concept to chew on.
It really is. And that is all the time we have for this deep dive. I want to remind you, the listener, one more time, please like and subscribe to the show so you never miss a deep dive into these intense topics. And if this analysis hooked you, if you want to read the raw data, the syllogisms, and the full, unvarnished arguments we just spent this time dissecting, you need to go check out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy the book today.
It's Childish Thinking, Sawing Off the Limbs of the World Tree by Conrad Riker.
Finally, if you want to follow the author for more of his essays and material, you can find him at Conrad Riker on Substack. Thank you so much for exploring this highly challenging material with us today. Keep your eyes open, keep mastering the trivium, and above all, keep questioning the narratives around you. We'll see you next time.